And from the Institute for Nonprofit News, we have Sue Cross. So, Sue, how long have you been with INN, aside from the start?
Unmute. 8 years. Just about 8 years. So, yeah.
And the INN, like Lion is for local independent news. INN is for nonprofit news specifically. It does a lot of strategy for that. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start by having each of you do about 20 minutes talking about your operation. Most of our publishers here are operating for profit. Some are nonprofit, but they're curious about how the nonprofit sector, the challenges of operating nonprofit news, the benefits of being nonprofit. Of course, they're in South Africa, which has a different legal and economic structure. So, some of the stuff that we're doing here in the States may not apply directly to them, but some of them are interested in this sector. So if you could just talk a little bit about it. So I've got to mute the speakers on my end to avoid any kind of feedback and things like that. So, just bear with me through that. What we'll do is the presentations first, then we'll take a break, and then after that, we'll do the question and answer, if that's okay. Okay, Sue, could you please start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Good morning, everybody. I'll try to give you a little bit of an overview of this whole nonprofit field, of which Baltimore Beat and Daily Yonder are parts and great examples of what's happening across the country. And now your interest in it is reflective of a growing global interest in these nonprofit models, because the economic pressures that we really face in commercial media are proving to be global indeed. Just a little bit so you know where I come from and what I'm about and what INN is, to give you a sense of that. And then I'll talk mostly about the field rather than INN itself. I spent most of my career in one of the largest news companies in the world, Associated Press. But it has some similarities in that AP is a not-for-profit cooperative. And so it's very mission-driven and is a network of its members and AP itself. So there were some similarities there, but I started as a reporter, editor, and then when digital came along, really got involved in digital news production and switched over to the business side. And trying to figure out, you could kind of see what was coming, all these economic issues we're grappling with, what would make these new models work. I actually got involved with INN in nonprofit news while I was still at AP. I was a national executive and INN formed. I knew some of the founders, and we arranged for distribution of some of this nonprofit news via the AP wires, trying to support this new field. So that was in 2009 when INN was founded. And really, nonprofits in the US, up until that point, there were a handful, but somewhere between a dozen and 24. And that was really it. They didn't exist. They were all, at that time, investigative news outlets. And it was because investigative news is the hardest to support commercially, takes the longest investment of time usually. And as you guys know, a lot of the investigation and reporting you do may not come to fruition as a story. And so INN was founded in 2009 when 27 of these organizations, mostly investigative, gathered, not initially intending to form this, but they were really worried about preserving investigative reporting in the coming economic storm. And so they set aside, what they decided, they met in a place called Pocantico and wrote something called the Pocantico Declaration. And what they did was, at the time, very remarkable. We're all used to collaboration now. But at the time, particularly investigative reporting, were very, very scrappy and competitive. But they said, in order to preserve this, we are going to set aside competing, and we are going to work as a consortium. We're going to report together. We are going to share content. We will create these common shared values, which still endure today and are becoming more important today. But those were values around, we are going to focus on original reporting. we are going to be transparent to the public about the source of our funding and the control of our news organizations. And I'll talk a little bit later about what's different about nonprofit news. But one of the things is it is more transparent than a private business. So in the US, if you are a nonprofit, you file a tax return that's open to the public that says, here are our sources of revenue, here are our top expenses. So anybody can go look up my salary and what I'm paid. And it's the same with the top 3 or 5, I think, in a nonprofit. So somebody can go look up and say, what are they about? And that's becoming more important as we have dark money, anonymous funding, launching kind of politically backed news startups in a number of places. And also as nonprofits spread and trust in media is shakier, that kind of transparency is taking on a new importance in building trust with the public and building these new models. So those are the origins of INN going back to 2009. Today, it has grown into a network of just about 450, somewhere between 425 and 450 news outlets across North America. We focus mostly in the US, but also have members in Canada. We have some in the Caribbean. I don't think we have any in Mexico right now, but it's focused on North America, and they operate as a network. So they all share content with each other. One of the distinctions of nonprofit news is that they are producing it as what is a public good. So rather than paywalling it, it is generally funded by donations, grants from philanthropy foundations. There also is ad and sponsorship and underwriting revenue coming in to a significant degree. And I'll share some of those trends with you shortly. But out of those things, they're creating news as a public good, as a shared community asset. And that means it's generally not paywalled. Anybody can access that news regardless of their ability to pay. That's part of the public measure of it. And much of this news is shared with other news media. So I mentioned there's more than 400 news organizations now. As of at the end of last year, we survey them at the end of each year, and they were distributing that news to more than 7,600 other news media. So there's a couple interesting dynamics to that. It's a new model where the original reporting is increasingly concentrated in the nonprofits, but they're sharing that with commercial models that are newspapers, broadcasters, both public media and private commercial media. So we focus on this nonprofit model, which isn't just a business model or a tax status, but you can see it really shapes the kind of news that can be covered. It also shapes the communities served, because commercial media can continue to exist in affluent communities and mainstream communities. It has never particularly served communities of color all that well in the United States, or communities that didn't have a great deal of wealth, or at least kind of, mid-level affluence and above. And so you are seeing nonprofits do more to reach those communities. So when I talk about nonprofits, that's kind of the model here. It has grown fastest in the United States because we do have this tax structure around nonprofits, and nonprofits are a big part of both what I would say is the US general culture and the business culture. So I think about 10% of jobs in the United States are in nonprofits. We often shorthand them. If you're talking to people in this country, they might shorthand nonprofits as C3s. That's from a tax designation called 501c3. So you might hear that term, 501c3 or C3 or nonprofit. There's a handful of other nonprofit forms, but those are the main ones. And so when we're talking about that model, for us, it's not that line you heard from Chris, and we have overlap in our memberships. Lion's a great organization. He's focused just on local. we're focused on supporting all kinds of nonprofits because they do have this different coverage model. So I told you it started out with investigative, and those are mostly national. So INN was entirely a network of investigative news outlets until 2015. And then it started to become apparent that this nonprofit model was needed much more broadly, particularly in local news. And so it changed its name to actually open it up to become for nonprofit news. And now we're seeing the growth of nonprofits really strongly in local news, community news. And those now make up nearly 40% of our membership. About the other 60% might be what you think of as verticals or topic subject specific. Daily Yonder is one focusing on rural issues. We have them covering environment, education, prisons, criminal justice, social justice, all those kind of complex beats where you really need deep beat reporting to cover a complex issue or it has civic importance. And that's what's fallen out as commercial newspapers have cut back. And then there are national and global. You may have heard of ProPublica, which is perhaps the biggest national nonprofit news outlet in the United States. There are many others. And then there are global ones such as Coda News, which really covers Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Manga Bay, which covers environmental issues around the globe from an equity lens, and there are many others. So they vary a lot in what they're doing. The commonality is that sense of mission and those models and that collaboration, which is really intense between them. What that means is that you're seeing a kind of new ecosystem take shape in news. They aren't just isolated in this thing off to the side, this little niche called nonprofit news. They're providing that news. We, as best we can tell, nonprofit news, the reporting is now reaching virtually all Americans through those commercial media partners and digital platforms. So it's become a really significant source of reporting. To give you some idea of how that scale comes together, so I said there are, 425 to 450 of these. They're small, right? When you think about it overall, they have like an average or median size, somewhere around 7 staffers. Now that varies greatly from ones that are just starting with all volunteer efforts up to ones that have 70, 80 or more staffers. But if you take that middle or flatten them out, there's 7 or 8 people. And so you think, oh, that's really small. What are they doing? But it's much more concentrated in news reporting, and they don't try to cover everything. If you think about traditionally, newspapers covered entertainment, sports, business, everything. The nonprofits are generally going to the community and saying, what do you most need covered? Starting with that topic, whether it's the local education system or city government or environmental issues. And they start with that, and then it grows like rings on a tree as they branch out. As they grow, build community support, they'll tend to add more beats and more coverage areas. But going back to their size, so they're individually small, but when you add it up now, there are about in most of our members are digital first. So we could digital native or online primarily. And if you take those, the ones that are completely independent, they have about 2,700 journalists and probably somewhere around 4,000 total staff. If you add in, we have a certain number of public media members, that's a radio and TV based, partly government funding, most publicly supported nonprofits. We have the ones that are transparent about their funding, do a lot of digital, and actually have newsrooms. If you add those in, the editorial staff of this INN network is now up around 4,200 journalists. By comparison, the biggest remaining newspaper group in the US, which is Gannett Gatehouse, has fallen to somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000. So this network of what we think of as small, independent, scattered all over, is now probably the biggest alliance or organization of any sort by number of journalists across the country. And this is becoming more significant because they're starting to create networks within the network. Again, working together is in their DNA. It's not like that, ooh, we're competing. Okay, we need to save resources. Let's collaborate. The collaboration is right from their foundation. They almost all collaborate or work with other media from the get-go. And so Tim, who you'll hear from shortly, is part of a subgroup called the Rural News Network in the US, which is now 70 members in mostly very rural areas of the United States, covering these rural places and rural issues. And Daily Yonder is a really important national specialist in that. So they've kind of formed a network, and they collaborate within that and are looking at shared resources, distribution, other things that they can do together. So the ecosystem that's forming is this kind of networks within networks. There's a lot of national, local collaboration as well. And they share resources through INN, also through Lion. I mean, we have a full-time staffers in audience development and major gifts who just work for members. They just work as coaches, helping them apply tools, figuring out what tools they need. So they're not really doing like INN staff stuff. They're just a shared resource for the members. The members also share media insurance, and the other thing I'll talk about is it's starting to move from collaboration around editorial to collaboration around revenue generation and distribution as well. So I'll start with distribution, then come back to revenue and talk about some of the funding models in nonprofit news, because I think that's of interest everywhere around the globe, where we're all trying to figure out how to support strong reporting. On distribution, here, I'm not sure how it is in South Africa. Here it's become very fragmented, right? Older Americans are still subscribing to newspapers, younger are not. The conventional broadcast audience also has gotten much older. Younger people are getting news more off YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, zines, just this whole variety of things. And about 65% or 70% of the news consumption is on this, it's on the phone. So distribution's becoming very complicated. Some of the ways the networking works in going beyond editorial collaboration is we will help. If we're helping organize a collaboration of members, they're doing the reporting, the editing, the shaping, but often INN will help get distribution. We'll get the package out to some big national news outlets or out on digital platforms, or just orchestrate the sharing so it can reach a bigger audience and have even more impact. So you're also seeing other distribution arrangements like that come about, where small local organizations will collaborate with a national. The national has much greater reach and audience. The newish, they're all under 15 years for the most part. The newish smaller organizations wouldn't have that kind of reach. And so there'll be but can do the localized reporting, and there's a kind of exchange of value there. I want to get to collaborative funding, and then I'll stop. But to give you a sense of the overall economic picture and what makes up the next mix for nonprofits, it is different than for-profits, because it's never been really ad-based. So while commercial operations, and some here are switching from commercial to nonprofit, had a very heavy ad base initially, and as you all know, that's been disrupted really terribly for everyone. The nonprofits never really had that. The early ones started with very heavy foundation funding, and that's something we have more of in the US than most regions of the world. That's another reason this model is developed so much faster here. So in the very early days, foundations were funding, 60, 70, 80% of the budgets of these nonprofit startups. Everybody thought it was kind of experimental, probably just a temporary thing till we all figured out some new business model that worked. And of course, that didn't happen. It really was a market failure, and this is more permanent. And so what's happened over time, that grant funding is still important, but it's fallen under 50%. So it's under half the support of nonprofits in the US is coming from institutional philanthropy. So what's growing? Individual giving. And that in many markets is reader revenue. The closest equivalent for commercial would be circulation. If somebody's subscribing, except what we're finding in the US is that attitudes toward news are changing. People don't want to subscribe. Older Americans still will, but younger ones won't, but they will donate. And there's only been a few studies showing this kind of evolution, but people are increasingly willing to donate to support the news in their community. And that's a huge, huge culture shift. Maybe Baltimore Beat and Tim can talk about that a bit, because we're all used to news being mostly ad supported. So you have to go out and say, no, here's what we do. This costs us this to produce. And while all these news organizations maintain their editorial independence, and they are very clear to that with donors. If you give us money, that doesn't mean you have an input on the coverage. They are out saying, well, we're building this together as something for the community, so please support it. And here's the coverage we're doing. If you like that, if you depend on it, please support it. So individual giving is growing, and it's now more than a third of the revenue overall. And then advertising and sponsorship, and that's a range here. Advertising can be just advertising like it, might be display advertising or other. And then sponsorship and underwriting is more between advertising and a donation. It isn't commercial, it's not a coupon, it's not transactional. It's more like underwriting. They want to affiliate with the brand. And so they may sponsor an area of coverage, sponsor an event, sponsor, just be a sponsor and say, we support this publication. And you'll see both businesses and nonprofits do that. So that's kind of the funding mix overall. The thing I'll close on is when I'm talking about how collaboration is spreading. About 5 years ago, INN and a coalition of funders started something called Newsmatch, that is the largest grassroots campaign for news in the US. It runs at the end of every year. Americans have a very deep, strong tradition of giving to charity at the end of each year. There used to be tax incentives for it. They've almost all disappeared, but it's still a habit. It's a tradition in the culture here. So this is mostly end of year fundraising, and the major philanthropists put up match funds and say, okay, we're putting up, and they collectively put in a few million into a central kitty, and then partner funds that are dedicated to like environmental journalism or diversity, equity, and inclusion or education coverage. They put those in, and the nonprofit news organizations get a match from them. For every individual who donates up to $1,000 to that news organization, the philanthropists match that $1,000. So they could go out to the community and say, this news is so important that these national philanthropists are putting up this huge stake, and they will match us, match your donation. They will double it. And there's a cap. It's usually between 15 and 20,000 a year, but they'll match that. And that is growing the individual donations. So you may think this sounds like a US only thing, but interestingly enough, there are other ways to adapt it. So I've talked a lot with networks of independent media in Australia. Very different. They don't have charity status or the same nonprofit status, but they do have a lot of independent small media growing. And some of those are nonprofit under a kind of the what that means in Australia. Some are for profit, but they have a different fundraising tradition. They don't have any of this nonprofit donation tradition at the end of the year, but people in Australia give around disaster seasons, like much of the US. They have wildfires, they have flood seasons, and they can be devastating. And so there usually are campaigns around that, and Australians really pull out money from their pockets and donate for disaster relief. And so some of the news organizations are saying, as they go into fire season, for example, hey, we know you count on us and you turn the dial to this radio station, or you go to our online website to find out what's coming and get all the warnings and get all the information our community needs to stay safe. Would you donate so that we will be here through this as you think about disaster relief, help us with disaster prevention and handling, and are building some community funding appeals around that. In Korea, giving comes around major life events, weddings, births, and that. And so you can think of asking the public to support you around a variety of mechanisms. And I think that's important for for-profits as well as nonprofits. The last thing I'd say about that, since you're mostly for-profits, is if you do that, even if you're for-profit, think about being transparent about how you collect, who you collect from, and how you spend any funds that you're asking the community to donate. Because if you don't, and you're a for-profit and you're not transparent and you're reaching out to the community and saying, give us money, but there's no community sense, it won't go very far. It'll just be seen, it can be seen as a kind of cynical ploy to just get a revenue stream. Whereas if you share that with the community and say, here's how we're spending it to benefit the community, here's the funds you gave us, here's how we're using it, that can build trust with the community. So that's something a lot of for-profits are thinking about around the world as they weigh whether should we turn nonprofit or how do we rethink this industry to kind of create a more public service model. So I will stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Sue. Again, we're going to do questions afterward, but I really appreciate that you brought up that point of if people don't know that you're struggling, they're going to assume that you're not. Andy Alexander was here the other day and he brought up the same point. I brought up the same point earlier, and there's a new study by Terry Finneman out of University of Kansas that really reinforces that point. So our other two speakers are independent nonprofit journalists. They run news organizations. As we talked about at the beginning of this of the week, you know, most community media are layered. They're not just communities of place, they're communities of place and identity, or communities of identity and communities of mission and things. So both of these publishers serve layered communities. I want to start with Lisa because Lisa's working in the city of Baltimore to basically revive a publication that had been there and bring it into sustainability in the 21st century. So Lisa, could you please start?
Absolutely. Very happy to be here and talk to you all today. Like you mentioned, the Baltimore Beat has lived a few lives already in relatively short time that we've existed. We grew out of the end of Baltimore City paper. That was a 40-year-old alt weekly. I think of alt weekly as kind of companion pieces to mainstream daily news, because this alt weekly came out every week, and it wasn't going to be the daily news that you get from like the Baltimore Sun to say, okay, the mayor had a press conference. Instead, it's a wider scope of what this press conference means. What are the longer implications? What does this mean? There was also a lot more of what we call muckraking journalism that's finding finding places of corruption, uncovering things that maybe the daily papers can't really put a lot of energy into on a daily basis. City paper or all weekly stories can kind of delve into those more. Also, a very serious investment in arts and culture news. So a lot of times people who weren't even looking to be engaged in, what the mayor or our city council or any of our elected officials are doing, are looking for, where are the parties? Who are the new up and coming musicians? Who are the important visual artists? And so we were doing that work at City Paper, and it was ended, and we decided to continue it by starting the Baltimore Beat. Baltimore Beat came out about 2 weeks after the last issue of City Paper was published. We came out first as a for-profit model. We had a publisher who lived in Baltimore City, but published a paper in Washington, D.C., which is about 45 minutes away from Baltimore, but was invested in Baltimore and said, we still need the kind of work that City Paper was doing. So we sold ads. We had a person that was their dedicated job. And it was, again, a weekly paper. After about 5 months, that publisher called me up one morning and said, hey, sorry, we can't do this anymore. The money's not there. And we're pretty much pulling out immediately. Like, for this week, there's no paper. So again, I still knew that we needed that alt weekly voice in the city. We also needed something that was really intentional about speaking to a city that is more than 60% African American. And so for me, there was still a need. And that's when I started kind of finding what Sue just talked about. I started finding reporters without newsrooms that were figuring out what to do and turning to the nonprofit model. And the way that it was kind of convincing to me was that, number one, the kind of work that we're doing that kind of upsets powerful institutions in Baltimore City means that ads can affect that work. We could write about a big, powerful company in Baltimore, and then they immediately pull all their ads, and then we don't have a paper anymore. It also, as a person that was kind of like not independently wealthy in any way, I was like, I can get small dollar donations. So we had what we called a Patreon that we started, and people just pitched in $5, $10, $15 a month. So for me, I was like, this gives me the kind of power that I would not have otherwise. Otherwise, I'd have to go and find investors. And I did want to do that eventually, but I wanted to start now. So where I could start was our small dollar donations. So we relaunched the Baltimore Beat about a year after it abruptly ended as a nonprofit outlet. We did not have a physical paper at that point. We were just online. At that point, it was really me, Boots, kind of doing as much as I could by myself with my co-founder, Brandon Soderberg, who was the former editor-in-chief of Baltimore City Paper. At one point, it was just me because Brandon wrote an amazing book about police corruption called I Got a Monster. There's also recently been a documentary, so you guys should look that up if you're interested in police corruption. Just working it out, kind of flying the plane as we were building the plane and figuring out how to even cross over from being just a reporter to now being a publisher and an executive and a fundraiser. Did that for a while. And in 2020, at this point, I was still very much committed to the Beat, but needed a full-time job. So I was working at a nonprofit here in Baltimore. Brandon gave me a call and said, I have some news that's going to sound unbelievable, but it's true. And that was that a family foundation here in Baltimore, a white family foundation that had been giving out money kind of piecemeal, felt very convicted by the pandemic that had happened at this point and the way that it was disproportionately affecting Black communities. And also at this point, folks were really taking to the streets and being active around the issue of police brutality because George Floyd had been killed. And they felt like as white folks, they wanted to do more to help. So they were like, this small dollar donation isn't doing it. We want to do something larger. And so they divested pretty much all of their money into the Beat, and that was about $1 million. So at that point, it gave us, $1 million is not a lot of money, but it did give us a chance to step back a little bit and really work on the plane, like take a little bit of a break and say, what do we want this to be? How can we make this work in a long-term way? What can we do within this money? For me, it was really important to go back to having a physical paper. We right now have a physical paper that comes out every 2 weeks because Baltimore is a city with unequal information access. I live with my phone in my hand, but there are still lots of folks who don't have consistent access to the internet. So they're missing out on a lot of the news that's happening. I was also able to hire some full-time staffers, which has always been an important issue for me and for the beat, because even though Baltimore is a Black city, in the years that I've worked here, there's usually not a lot of Black folks in newsrooms. So it's not being properly reflected. And I know so many folks who are Black journalists who have awful experiences in white newsroom trying to tell their stories, trying to point out inequity and having that kind of silence because it's like, oh, well, you're being biased. We're not supposed to be biased, being silenced in that way. And so a lot of times they just don't stay in the industry. So it was important to me that I use some of that money to invest in Black journalists and Black editors. So we relaunched the Beat in August of last year. Like I said, we have a paper that comes out to 20 pages every 2 weeks. There's always going to be a news piece. There's always going to be an arts piece. We have 2 community calendars, which I feel are very important. Our arts and culture calendar is, fun parties, art exhibits, music, stuff like that, which I think is important and helps grow community. But also we have a community calendar. So that is Baltimore City Council meetings, that is meetings of other city agencies, but also that's just regular folks who are organizing around issues that are important. Every week in our calendar, we have West Wednesdays, organized by a woman named Tawanda Jones, whose brother was killed by Baltimore City Police several years ago. So she has not felt that she's gotten any restitution and no one in the city has addressed the death of her brother. So every Wednesday since his death, there's a gathering that is held to talk about her brother, to talk about other Black victims of police brutality. There are people that are organizing around renters' rights. There are people that are organizing around environmental rights. And I want to make it easier for them to fix those problems. So I'm like, you don't have to have a lot of money I can't pay for you to have a space to organize. But I can say you can, for free, have your meetings publicized in Baltimore Beat. And I think that those things are important. Trying to think of what else I want to say.
You talk about the drop boxes.
Oh, yes. Another thing that when we got our $1 million, we felt was very important. The Baltimore City paper always had these kind of iconic yellow newspaper boxes. That's what you when you thought of Baltimore City paper, that's what you thought of. But the thing that we always complained about was that these places were only in the white sections of the city. Baltimore is not obviously officially a segregated city, but it is a segregated city in the way that many places in the world are. It's kind of an unspoken segregation. So we have an academic at Morgan State University, which is a historically Black college, has coined the term the white L and the Black butterfly. So the white L is central Baltimore. That's the most resourced. That's where most of white folks or people with money live. The Black butterfly is East and West Baltimore. That's where most Black people live, and those are less resourced. So we always complain that the papers, which were free, always free, were only in the white parts of the city. So again, missing out on so many people in Baltimore. So we wanted to bring back the tradition of those boxes. We wanted to be able to make it very easy for everyone to access the information in the Baltimore Beat. But we also were seeing, because of rising housing prices, because of worsening gaps in income, folks were doing these things called community pantries already in the city, where you could donate produce, you could donate canned goods, you could donate whatever you wanted. And we wanted to incorporate that into our boxes. So we partnered with a local makerspace, and they designed what we call in our Beat boxes. and they have a space for the paper, but in the top of each box is a little mini kind of community pantry area where folks have, we have about 10 of them out on the streets right now, and folks have put, masks, they've put COVID tests in them, they've put feminine hygiene products. We're hoping to have all of them stocked with Narcan, which can help people when they're overdosing. And so those are just other more tangible ways that we want to be really invested and involved in our community. So you can get the paper, you can get information, but also if you're hungry, maybe there's a can of some food in there. People have put like hamburger helper, which is like a mix that you can add ground beef and it'll give you like a cheap meal. People put like green peppers and produce. So that's all the way that we want to kind of be more involved and active in our community. I want to say also, as we're talking about the nonprofit model, in a way, it can seem like, I think it's human nature to look for new things and think that they are the next new thing and hope that they are kind of the bridge to the future. And what I found that in some ways it is, like it was very empowering to be able to say, look, I'm bypassing a lot of the seats of power and money and say, you can give me direct money and I can put that directly, like you'll see those dollars. But the larger the beat is, the more we're going to need more money than that. Like right now, the Baltimore beat has, we have a good foundation of folks who are just donate occasionally, and also people that are repeating donors. And that money helps, all money helps, but that will never be enough to sustain us. And to make sure that my employees, I'm a full-time employee. I have one other full-time employee right now. And then we have 3 contractors. That will never be enough to make sure that like my arts and culture editor has good health insurance and a 401k. And so that means that I am then still kind of having to go to folks in power and hope that people with a lot of money understand that Black people getting information is important, that people in Baltimore City is important. So it still can be an unequal system. I've seen a blessing and a curse in that there are lots of foundations that feel the same way as our donors, the Lillian Hollis Center family did, and they understand the importance of targeting minoritized communities. So there is money out there specifically for BIPOC funders, so people that are Black, Latinx, Indigenous. There is money out there for people that are doing news specifically for gay, lesbian, trans, other minoritized groups. But there's also a lot of money out there that we will never get because it's not looking to fund that money because it's kind of still the overall worldview, which is that it's harder. We have another nonprofit that started here in Baltimore that I launched with $1 million. They've launched with multi-million dollars because they had access to a gentleman who wanted to buy the Baltimore Sun and couldn't. And so that's just way more funded. They're able to do a lot more than the beat is right now. He could have given me that money, but he didn't. He started a whole nother thing. So it's not a perfect model, but for me right now, the model works that we can still pursue money outside of Baltimore, outside of folks that maybe I might anger, and folks that are looking to make sure that people like me and people like the communities that I'm serving have a voice. So it's always going to be a gift and a curse with any funding, source.
Lisa, thank you so much. We're going to move now to Tim Marima. So the Daily Yonder is a daily read for me, and it covers the rural issues across the country. But it's based out of the Center for Rural Strategies. In fact, the Center for Rural Strategies is a nonprofit advocacy group, and the Daily Yonder is published by them. So instead of being a news operation first, it actually is a research and advocacy group first that publishes this online resource, and it's excellent. So with that, I'm going to switch over to Tim.
Thanks so much, Bill. It's a real honor to be with you. I've looked at your agenda for the week, and you've had a lot of activity. So I'll try to stay awake, if you will, for the next little bit here, because I know you've been busy. It looks like a great program, and thanks for inviting the Daily Yonder to be part of it.
If
Bill.
some of us look drowsy, it's because we're all doped up on Dayquil.
Yeah, okay, all right. And I was just thinking of my first newspaper, full-time newspaper job. They said the sick policy was, well, you may get sick, you may take a day, but if you're going to hit 2 days, you better have a doctor's excuse. I feel for people who are feeling below the weather. And also to Sue and Lisa, it's fascinating to hear about the field and especially what's happening in Baltimore. It's been such an important locus for national stories, and important things have played out there, especially during COVID and during the George Floyd reactions in 2020. So thank you for sharing that. I'll describe a little bit about my background, the Center for Rural Strategies, and then sort of where the Daily Yonder fits into that. And as Sue said, some of it is not going to be applicable to what's happening for your publications. I think enough of it will be that there might be some ideas that might be helpful. So I went to a small private college in Kentucky for primarily for low-income students, and we had a labor program, Berea College, and I was lucky enough to work at the weekly newspaper there when I was a student. So I started on a manual typewriter and cold type, developed film, printed photos, ran a process camera, waxed things, pasted up, the whole 9 yards, swept, took classified ads, everything. Went to graduate school at the University of North Carolina for journalism after Berea. And then I landed, I was a copy editor on an afternoon paper in Durham for about 6 months. And then I landed with an expansion of the morning paper there in Durham that was doing what we called a wraparound edition for Chapel Hill. So kind of a hometown paper contained within a larger newspaper for the region. And so I edited that section, and I tried to conceive of it as a weekly newspaper that came out daily, was sort of how I looked at it. Very focused on local issues. Left there after about 5 years, and went to work for a nonprofit media organization that did documentary film and media arts and radio called Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky. And then with friends from there, we started the Center for Rural Strategies in 2001. And our idea was that we wanted to be a nonprofit organization. That's the economy and the work that we knew. And we wanted to, we felt like the stories of rural America were not being used effectively for the development of good rural policy. So we wanted to be a communications group that would help providers of housing, education, healthcare, community development, and other services communicate in ways that would be effective for them to accomplish their missions. We worked a lot with news outlets in that work. And a primary one was with the National Public Radio, NPR, which is a significant news system in the United States. We did polling of rural voters and tried to raise the profile of rural voters as a way of increasing politicians and news media's attention to rural issues. And then we, along the way, working with these journalists, they said, you should be doing your own journalism. That there were so many stories that could be told, and that if we were part of that journalism mix, we would be helping the field and providing a good service. So that's what we did. A guy named Bill Bishop, who wrote a book called The Big Sort, was our founding editor in 2007. He and his wife, Julie Artery, pretty much ran the outfit as a mom and pop. And we started publishing then. In 2012, I became editor. I was kind of special projects and this and that with the and a founder of the organization. In the last few years, we've expanded quite a bit, and I'll talk some more about that. But first, kind of around the mission question, as Bill said, within nonprofit organizations, mission comes as the first thing. Why are we doing this? And I think this is aligned really well with news organizations because every news organization has a public purpose. If you were there to generate fortunes for yourself or others, you're probably in the wrong business, and you know that. So the idea that there is a public good behind journalism fits really well with a nonprofit model where all organizations have a public purpose, including the journalism ones. So our idea was that we wanted to make rural America visible to itself, to help people in diverse rural locations across the U.S. understand what they had in common with each other, how their issues might play out differently. The Southwest is much different than Southern Appalachia, where I'm from, which is very different from frontier areas of Alaska, which is very different from the agricultural breadbasket. But each of these areas has something in common, and it has to do with population densities, the difficulty of delivery and services to rural areas, communications infrastructure being lacking, jobs being hard to come by often, kind of endemic areas where poverty kind of has just been intergenerational. A lot of this, we thought people in these different circumstances didn't understand that they had something in common with other parts of the United States. The other thing is that we felt like the service providers who are working in housing and education and these different fields didn't know a lot about each other. And so if you take rural America, which is about roughly 20% of the US population, and then you divide it into rural education and rural housing and rural development, et cetera, the numbers get really, really small. So what we were trying to do was to organize around rural as an identity and as a focus, so that we could bring these different voices and concerns and kind of into one room where they could make a little bit more of an impact. So we also felt that rural issues and rural communities were not adequately reflected in the predominant media. And this could range from metropolitan regional dailies and television on up to the largest newsrooms in the United States. Now, our idea was that we could help those media outlets understand rural America better. We could provide information that could feed into their stories, and we could provide kind of media criticism and response and critique that would help other journalists understand what we felt like was important for rural America. And the key there, I think, is audience. There is some fantastic rural reporting in outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, especially. ProPublica has done some great stuff, Kaiser Health News. But what we found is that because, especially with the place-based like Washington Post and New York Times, and to some extent NPR, because of the place-based nature of those outlets, the audience for those stories affected how the stories are reported. And so you're reporting rural news for New York City, and not just New York City, but for the New York Times, increasingly for an international kind of elite crowd. And so you see things like the word Hamlet. It's a hamlet. What the hell is a hamlet? We don't use that word. No one calls their town a hamlet. I never heard it except in the New York Times, for example.
Tim, I told them about how the New York Times finds that someplace always has to be nestled somewhere. That word-
Nestled, there you go. Yeah, perfect. Great, Bill. Thank you. I'm going to go down to the hamlet and get some coffee. Remote, isolated. You know, these are terms that just kind of flow out of the typewriter or the keyboard when urban organizations are writing about rural America. It's not necessarily wrong, but it sets a tone that we feel like is not reflective. And I'll give you one example. So I'm from Southern Appalachia, coal mining, deep extractive industries that have been horrible for the land and people. And yet we get coverage that says we need to industrialize. It's like, well, honey, we're post-industrial. We beat you to the punch. They've already pulled up the railroad tracks where I grew up. It doesn't get much more post-industrial than that. So you get these analyses and language that sort of puts rural in a certain light. And we felt like we could help reframe that discourse in a way that might help policymakers understand what the problems were and what might be solutions, to help rural people understand that they had connection and that they could be listened to and that their stories could be reflected well and accurately in media, and that we could be a resource for other journalists covering rural America. So we currently we reach about I think our latest figures annualized would be about 1.7 million unique users a year. That's somewhere around 150, 170,000 a month. And that's the primary, that's kind of the base of our operation. And we produce content, primarily text and pictures, sometimes video, for our website, dailyyonder.com. We've gone to a system where we're adapting that content into a 3-minute radio news program. And with an ally, public news service, we're focusing on small market commercial radio stations in the US with the goal of getting our stuff more directly into small markets, rural, small towns, on commercial radio, which is the most listened to type of radio. We also have ramped up republication. Our stuff, as Sue was saying, our stuff is free to republish. We have, thanks to the technical people we're working with, we've got a republish button. This is something that INN has been working on as well to make it easier for other publications to just pick up our stuff and run it. We're also feeding into news aggregators like Apple News and MSN and others like that. And that probably the radio audience, the numbers are a little squishy to me, but it's going to be somewhere around just under 1 million listeners a week, perhaps about 140 stations, depending on how it's tracked. So it's increased our audience exponentially. Then we also get republished in outlets that we can't really count the numbers. Weeklies will pick up our stories from time to time. And to me, that's a home run for us. If we get picked up by a weekly, that means that we really hit the mark, because someone thinks the story is targeted enough to serve their readers in a small market print publication. That's kind of ground zero by my standards anyway. So along with adding those, and then we have about 18,000 email subscribers to a variety of different, a news digest, and then a couple different, an essay type emails, and a Q&A interview email. The funding mechanism for all of this primarily is philanthropy and foundations, which are within our tax code. If you're a billionaire, Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and many others have set up these foundations. They kind of come from the robber baron era of Andrew Carnegie, the Carnegie Corporation is one of our funders, Henry Ford, industrialists who made a lot of money and were able to set aside major amounts of it as charitable institutions, and they give away money that isn't theirs to organizations like ours. So when we started in 2001, the world we knew, the economy we knew, since we came out of a nonprofit background, was foundation fundraising. And so we stayed within that. We started Rural Strategies with a grant from the Ford Foundation Community Development Program. We had another grant soon thereafter from the Kellogg Foundation, which is which was founded by the cereal magnate Kellogg Company. And so we've built on that for the past 20 years. And the way things have worked for us revenue-wise is that the foundations, as Sue will tell you, and Lisa too, there are relatively few organizations that want to fund journalism per se. There are many more that want to fund education projects, environmental projects, housing, community development, lots of different areas of interest. And so our primary method for raising the majority of our funding has been to approach funders who are interested in the areas that we're working within and describing how our work relates to their areas of concern. And sometimes they have like a civic discourse funding stream that we can tap into, democracy interests, which is what's happened at Carnegie. Other times it's more about a topic like the environment, which is the case with Nathan Cummings Foundation, which was an early supporter and continues to support us. And I think the reason this has been a successful approach for us is it's what we knew how to do. It's where our background was. And we knew how to talk about how journalism about these issues could be instrumental in making change, essentially, and how there was a deficit of information around rural America. And if we could help fill that, then the idea is you get better policy as a result, and you get different actions. And importantly, within journalism, we're not guaranteeing what those actions are. We're not saying we're going to lobby for particular policies, but our coverage is going to inform that debate. And then when we started in 2007, we were an odd duck in the journalism field and in the nonprofit field. As Sue was saying, Investigative News Network, now the Institute for Nonprofit News, that started right about that same time. And she said how few organizations were in nonprofit news at that time. There really wasn't a field per se. And so we were weird because the nonprofits we covered, we wouldn't just run their press release or, give them a no holds barred platform to reach an audience. So they were like, and why did you quote somebody on the other side of this issue? That seemed, why are you doing that? Well, because it's journalism and we're covering more than just one organization's point of view. So nonprofits could be a little bit suspicious because it was a news model. And then on the other side of things, news organizations were suspicious because we had this connection to a group that had a public purpose agenda. So we were kind of neither fish nor fowl for a long time. As the nonprofit sector news has grown up, what we've seen is that our practices kind of came into line with a lot of other what are considered best practices now within nonprofit news, which is alliances with other news organizations, working cooperatively with nonprofits to help you learn about topics and examine possible solutions and report on that. Distribution models that we had of serving specific communities have become more common. There are environmental publications like GRIST, who we have a production partnership with. There's the Marshall Project, which looks at criminal justice issues. There's the Food and Environmental Reporters Network, which looks at food and the environment. There's a number of investigative reporting groups. And we kind of fit these days much more squarely within the nonprofit news sector, I feel like. And part of that has been our maturation and the growth of nonprofit news and the acceptance of some of these practices that were a little unusual in their time, but have now kind of moved far more mainstream. The one other thing I wanted to comment on was the rural media environment, and I think I'll end here. Part of our purpose is to provide alternative information and viewpoints into the rural and national media environment because rural America is generally politically more conservative than the rest of the nation. Historically, rural America, it's impossible to imagine our civil rights movement or the labor movement without deep involvement of rural areas. The Deep South was, the rural Deep South was where the civil rights movement, has its roots. The labor movement includes tons of farm workers and rural workers. So it's not as if there's a lock conservative political emphasis within rural areas. This has happened. Bill Clinton won the rural vote in at least 92, came close in 96. The idea that rural voters tend more Republican is a relatively new phenomenon. And so we wanted to, and the infrastructure that exists within rural communities, they're going to have a small radio station, a community paper if they're lucky. And as these things have diminished, the national news channels and talk radio and conservative Christianity have moved in to fill the information void. There are many news deserts, but I say nature abhors a vacuum, and they're going to get information from somewhere. And there are institutions in the US that are all too happy to provide it. And it is generally not reflective of sort of mainstream thought in many ways. So what we wanted to do was provide an alternative stream of information to reach rural communities that would contain, alternative viewpoints, diverse communities, diverse voices, and kind of push back against this narrative that rural America is all white, all Republican, all Christian, and it has those elements, but it's only a few points less diverse than the rest of the United States. There are many parts of the U.S. that are majority people of color within the counties, so we wanted to help kind of set the record straight and give groups within those categories kind of some breathing room to be able to communicate and to understand that there were others like them around the United States. Thank you.
Thank you all three. Okay, with that, we're going to take a 15-minute break. And so we'll see you back at the bottom of the hour. Thank you.
you spoke about us, you don't come into the, oh, by mistake in our.
This is me, sorry.
But it's just.
Hello, hello, hello.
But as a nonprofit, she's eligible for that. You know,
Yeah.
if she had stuff for profit, she would have never been able to
Hello, hello.
apply for it.
Okay, I'm saying yes.
Made by one of the delegates in the conference.
How are you feeling on this
No,
fifth
I'd
day?
like to ask a question about when I can get a
No,
nap.
John, still the mic.
Should we go to the Bluetooth?
No, it's not basic.
That's why it's wireless.
Hmm, isn't-
It's just that they need to find and you ask.
No, it's not.
No, there's
It
the.
hasn't picked it up. You might need to leave and rejoin.
Okay,
What it is that.
Will you be able to do that easily?
yeah.
All right, we're gonna have to get ready to get going.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not coming. Okay, let's try it.
Okay, I'd love to ask the question about whether this roving mic works better than just using the phone mic.
Okay. How about now?
And now, how is it working now? Okay, and you want to try with, how, is it better or not significantly better than this? Better than this?
Very slight. It's not bad.
Okay, up to you.
Should we try now without this?
If you're more comfortable.
I am
What
currently.
would you prefer? What did you?
I can do both. It depends which one produces the best quality.
I think this is slightly better.
Slightly better.
As long as you get close enough to the mouth.
Perfect.
And then you just keep an eye on me until something happens, sometimes battery die.
Right.
Just keep on.
I will keep
How's
looking.
your battery like on your phone?
I think it will work for maybe 2 hours.
Because.
Do you have charger? Oh,
Okay, so if you start dropping low, I've got a,
oh,
well, actually, I've the wire. This one. No, I'm wrong. So what happens is this USB-C plugs in the base of the transmitter and it
Wow. wow.
charges the phone through that thing.
Right. Perfect. Yeah. I have battery, but if it started dying, I will connect.
Yeah, let's leave it from the charger while you've got battery.
Okay.
So I'm not going to be going for 2 or 4 hours.
Okay, I hope it will work.
Hi, Sue, we're talking about grant writers.
What about them? Is there a
We're
question?
just talking about how they have a
People
skill
looking
set
for
that
them?
most journalists don't have.
I actually, I'm going to say two things about that, I think journalists are very good grant writers. It's storytelling, right? It's not that much different. It's a little bit more like B2B, like you're writing for a peer, not the general public. But you're telling a story and there's a lead and there's a nut graph that's your case for why you should be funded. And then it goes to what impact you see.
But there is a rhetoric
What
to,
it'll
there is
take
a
to do
rhetoric
it.
to
So
grant
it's just a
writing
different story form.
there is a rhetoric to grant writing, though, that is different from journalism. Many times there's keywords you need to use, keywords to avoid, and many times, you know, it's like, where do you put the ask as opposed, you know, the journalist will put the ask right at the top, give me money, here's why. Whereas the other is like, there's this problem, blah, 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 and the problem is serious, and I know your organization is
Right.
interested in the problem. We bury the lead in the grant writing process.
Okay, that's fair, but all I'm saying is once you kind of get that, and each foundation's a little different. Some just want to ask for money, we're gonna do this, like night requests are like incredibly tight in their number of characters or words. Others want an opus. So it varies, but it is just storytelling. So don't freak out about it in that. The other thing I would say is that journalism is reporting is great preparation and not very different from fundraising. So journalists freak out about asking for money. It is the same as getting a source for a story. You're not going to get a source to talk to you because, well, I'm a reporter and I need to get this story done. You get the source to talk to you because you speak to their motivation, what they want to do and accomplish, and your funder is really your partner in that way. You're not going with a begging bowl saying, give me money because I need it, because they have a million people doing that every day. You're going and saying, I think you're interested in accomplishing this good in the world, and we'd like to work with you to do that. And you have the ability to do it that they don't have, and they have the money. So it's more a partnership, and it's very similar to cultivating sources, I would say.
Yeah, great. Are we recording? Okay, we're back on. Okay, so again, I'm going to have to mute the speaker for this, and then so after the question is asked, just take a pause while I turn on the speaker. Also, the question will appear in the chat as well in case there's any audio problems. Okay, the first question is from Simon.
Hi, directed mainly to Lisa, because she spoke of struggles in fundraising, and then there was a private funder who dispersed the amounts. Just wanted to find out from the state government provisions, how much is the pie for like non-profit funding, and also what stopped you from applying from the institutions, historical institutions like the Ford Foundation and any other foundation that really disperse structured funding?
Nothing is stopping me from applying to the Ford Foundation. I want to get, I'm muting. I'm not muted on my end. Can you guys hear me?
We can now.
Nothing is stopping me from applying from the Ford Foundation except for time. I want to get to them and ask them. I want to ask everybody. There was a little bit of a conversation between Sue and Bill talking about can journalists write grants? Can they not write grants? I do think that I could, but I am extremely busy. Money buys you time. So it's kind of like this cycle of when you have more money, you can hire folks to help with things. So the only reason I have not yet gotten to them is that I just have not yet had the time. We're still kind of branching out and learning about who we should make asks to and who we shouldn't. So we have made some major asks very recently in some of the larger foundations. We will find out soon, and we got our fingers and toes crossed on that one. To your second question, there is no pie when it comes to government funding for journalism right now. There are people working and advocating on our behalf that this should be a thing that should happen, because it is a thing that should happen. For me, I know a lot of Black and brown journalists. And so I first learned about some of the advocacy work that's happening to get money from the government from some Black and brown creators that are looking for that reason, because there's always going to be a deficit when you're talking about people that are a minority. So it's something that will hopefully with the way things are politically in this country, people will see the need of educating all of our citizens, but right now that's not an option for me.
Okay, next question. Slindili.
Good morning. This is directed to all three of you. Thank you for a great presentation. But I just would like to know, so what else are you doing besides donations? Because you have all said that grant funding is not enough. That's one. And I think it's Sue, yes, who mentioned that the network that you represent has like 425 to 450 members and keeps growing. So also, I just would like to know, would you say this is where more and more news or independent publishers should look to for solutions?
Yeah. I think so in the US, in what's happening, we do get a question a lot. Well, if there are more and more, are you just spreading the funds thinner and thinner? Particularly that news match program I talked about, as the growth, we actually capped the central pool at organizations of $1 million and under, just so the amounts wouldn't get smaller and smaller and smaller in those matches. But local matches are picking, and partner matches. That may sound like a technicality, but what I'm getting at is there's a trend there. As nonprofit news moves into more communities, it's generally communities that don't have any news and have never been asked to support news. And so just like Lisa was reflecting, it's often readers giving $5, $10, $15, and that mix varies by community. If you are in a community that's more well-to-do, you may get those $5, maybe $50, or you may be able to get higher. In communities that don't have a lot of wealth, the number of people who can afford to give small amounts may be lower, but you may be finding that big benefactor who really cares about the community. Or a corporation that's active in the community and does community support. And then local publications in particular are doing pretty well with advertising. While advertising is switched to digital, as you build that trust with the audience in the sense of a community publication, local businesses and even agencies in that want to be affiliated with the people who care about the local news. And so that's a significant revenue stream. It's above 25% on average for local publications, not so much for national or the statewide here, and specialized ones are kind of in the middle. So we do see a lot of variance. We're starting to see trends, but you see a lot of variance by community. Will stuff be enough in the long run? I don't think we know yet, honestly. I'm very hopeful though, for two reasons. So this field has been around roughly 15 years, a few a little more in the US. And very few of the nonprofits have failed. Only about 6% of those that we've been tracking that ever launch. There's many others that get in the planning stage and then just never get off the launch pad in startups. But those that launch or exist, they have proven pretty resilient. And the ones that start tiny with one person eventually get to 2, eventually get to 4. And they may stay small like weekly newspapers, but we do see them grow to a point that kind of mirrors the size of the community. So that's encouraging to me. And then that diversity of funding, that it is shifted and there now is public support and ad support. Some of them are also doing events and other kinds of earned revenue. Grant funding, I think, is the one that to me is we're going to need it. And I think philanthropists still have not wrapped their heads around that this is a permanent shift. Like they still say, are you sustainable, or what will support you in the long run? And unless you're in a pretty affluent community or doing pretty superficial news, and I don't mean that as to dismiss superficial news, but you're not really digging into those issues or covering things that might offend the powerful, you're going to need philanthropic support of some point over the long run. So I think that is a question over a long period of time. What can support this kind of journalism, and what is that mix going to look like? I think it'll keep evolving, but the trends we see are very positive and very hopeful. But I should say, just so I don't sound too Pollyanna, it's still really, really hard. I mean, these organizations really have to be smart and clever and driven and just constantly at it and constantly experimenting. It's really hard work to reinvent the field.
I would be curious to build on one of Sandili's question about government funding. I'm always, whenever somebody asks about government funding, I'm always like, that's unreliable money. It can be very politicized. It can be here and then go. Even quasi-governmental money. I mean, you know, like the Appalachian Regional Commission, they've got lots of money. Are they going to put it into this? And does that change with the administration? So what do you think about the idea of the government getting into the funding of media? Any of you?
I think that if it can be distributed like in the most, like ARPA funding, like here's your bucket of money, like, but I do think that you're raising some really good points in that. How do we make sure that, because like right now, Baltimore got a bunch of American Rescue Plan money. That's the money that the government has given out to kind of help folks recover from the pandemic. And so that still goes to our city government, and it's up to the mayor's discretion as to how that's funded. So it would need to be very, very thoughtful, because even as I was talking and answering his question about, I heard about this through the lens of minority journalists that were pushing for this money. The reason why they were pushing for this money is because if it comes, it's going to go to the white people. It's going to go to the larger, it's going to go to like ProPublica, which is nothing to say anything bad about ProPublica. They've been doing amazing work, but it still means that those same inequities that exist in the world will show up immediately in that. So there's a lot of thoughtfulness that has to go into it, but somebody needs to do something, because it can't just be people in pockets, you know, working ourselves to the bone to figure out how to eat and feed our staff the next day. So it's a little bit of, you know, both things. I also wanted to, while I have my mic on, I know that the lady that just asked a question was talking about other forms of funding. And so I was glad, Stu, that you mentioned events, because I think that events have so many ways to bring in money. Sometimes, you know, it's just actual literal money, but sometimes it's also like bringing people in to know about your organization. We had a Beyonce karaoke, and we had folks come that did not care anything about news, but they saw Beyonce advertised in karaoke and they came to that. So that buys us more investment in the community. Sometimes you can partner with another organization that's like, we can't buy a giant ad, but we can pool our resources and do a community event or educate folks about this or do this other thing. So I think that there's so many ways that events can help bolster a newsroom. And for us, we also have ads in this issue of our paper that's coming out next Wednesday. We have our first kind of, the Baltimore Museum of Art has been a big supporter of the Baltimore Beat. So they bought a year's worth of ads. So right now we have a full page ad for a hip hop exhibit celebrating 50 years of hip hop that will run, and then that'll change out when they have their next big exhibit. But also now we're experimenting with smaller dollar ads. We had a lot of folks that wanted to buy, like a lot of small businesses that wanted to buy ads when we first launched, and we've kind of been holding them at bay because we have to make sure that they can't do a huge buy. Like the Baltimore Museum of Art. So how can we make it so that it makes sense for us to be investing time in designing these ads and also make it worthwhile for them so that they're not trying to blow their budget on one ad. So we have one right now that's going to be a couple $1,000s or several $1,000s that'll run on my letters to the editor page in this issue. So we're just kind of starting to evaluate that too. But we don't have any barriers on accepting ads or not accepting ads. Like we can definitely do that as well.
Sorry, can I just follow up? I'm not sure if I missed it. What's your circulation?
I think it's 20K. That's how many of that we print every issue. I don't think I mentioned it. Sorry.
Sorry, do you have a cover prize?
A cover prize? I'm not sure I understand.
It's free distribution. Most city papers in the US have always been free. And so, there's kind of a tradition that, when you get the city paper is usually a guide for entertainment and things like that. So it serves residents and tourists.
Mhm.
Is that fair, Lisa?
Yes. And so we've had people try to buy subscriptions. And right now we just tell people, you can't buy a subscription, but you can go sign up to be a monthly donor. One of my long range plans is to sell, I want to have nicer publications that maybe put out once a year. That's like the best of Baltimore Beat. And those I would like to sell, but that's kind of a longer range plan.
Okay, next question. Chris.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's totally inspiring as well. I just want to find out, what are the cost drivers of your businesses if you guys get the funding from the various funding sources? How do you, just from a practical breakdown, what are the most expensive things that you apply the money to, and the cost drivers behind your business? Just want to find out about that.
I'll go first. Primarily personnel, so it's staff. Staff would be the first three. The fourth would be, depending on what you call it, correspondents or contractors, stringers, we would call them in the old days, but people, freelancers. We're unique in that our larger organization, we kind of do an admin fee for the back office sort of thing. So that's relatively affordable, but if you were on your own, you'd have to have space and bookkeeping and legal and all of those things. And another center is technology. Not a huge one, but a very important one. We're online plus these other, we're digital only, digital first, then these other products. But we have a contract with a service provider, Deucepack, that does WordPress operations and kind of keeps everything running for us.
Yes, definitely. People are the most expensive and they should be. They're doing hard work. So like I said, it was a priority for me that if you're a staffer here, you have a retirement plan, you're paid well, you have benefits. So those are always going to be very expensive. We also use some freelancers. We have a very small team of folks that deliver the papers that get paid a stipend. And we do have to pay money to get the papers printed, but that's honestly not a huge cost for us. I think most of our money goes towards paying folks. We also have NewsPath, which helps a little bit. I mean, we were able to get certain benefits even because we were a nonprofit through some of our internet hosting stuff. And NewsPath has been great for us because it looks clean and professional. And they're so responsive to journalists because they are journalists, and understanding we're figuring out how to also display our content. So I can't speak highly enough of NewsPad.
Sorry, is it NewsPath or NewsPad? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I have a terrible accent.
Oh, pardon.
It's News Pack.
PACK.
Okay, next question. Dunisani.
Good morning and thank very much for the presentation. Tim, I've got one question. In your presentation, you mentioned this fancy word, desert news. I mean, what do you mean by desert news?
Well, so it is an area that lacks local news outlets. Is it Penny Abernathy who kind of came up, or one of the early researchers in this area, and it's identifying areas that lack local news. They're called news deserts. We now have a desert for everything. There's child care deserts and maternal care deserts and water deserts, but news desert is a term that gets used a lot in our conversations here.
The news desert thing is complicated because like I said on day one, we have no idea how many news operations are operating in the United States at any given time. They start, they fold, some of them join organizations so we can track them a little bit. Some are fiercely independent. They're operating on their own under the radar. So the original news desert stuff, we actually started the news desert stuff here at Ohio University before Penny Abernathy did. A colleague of mine, Michelle Ferrier, got that launched. And we spent a year and a half trying to figure out how we can identify all the news media in any particular area. And it was almost impossible. And as Tim knows, it's like, do we use zip code? What defines rural versus urban? I mean, there's so many different variables, it's almost impossible. But generally, the idea is that if you don't have a source of local news coverage at least once a week, you're in a news desert. Okay, that's the general thing. And so, like we talked about, we had Milo Miller from the budget in Sugar Creek, Ohio here yesterday. They're based in Tuscarawas County, but they're right on the border with Holmes County, which is Ohio Amish country, and they cover Holmes County. But if you look at the news desert maps, Holmes County is a quote news desert because they don't have a newspaper in the county. But it's literally across the border is the budget, and they cover Holmes County like a blanket. So, the term can be, the maps can be misleading and stuff. It's good work. It's holy work to try to identify these things. But my take is that, also it's usually pinned to newspapers. And there are other ways to produce news than just newspapers. And so it's like if a county seat doesn't have a newspaper, they'll say that county is a news desert. Well, that's a little misleading because there might be other forms of news there that we just don't know about. Does that jibe with what you guys think, Tim and Sue?
And for me, like I don't think that Baltimore City is a news desert per se. We have the Baltimore Sun. We have a new, like the website I mentioned, Baltimore Banner. We have 3 TV stations. We have the Washington Post right up the street or up the road a little bit, but we don't have a lot of places that are specifically speaking to Black people. So I have found a lane, kind of a need in a place where there is journalism, knowing that there's kind of a community that is left out. Baltimore also has a growing Latinx population, and I don't know what's going on with them. Like, I think that I've heard tell of some kind of small Spanish language newspapers, but there's nothing on a broad scale here. So like even within a place where there's a lot of media, there's still segments that are left out of the communication. So it is kind of a complicated way to talk about where news is or is not.
Yeah, it really is. And then, of course, you get to the issue of just because a news medium exists in a place doesn't necessarily mean it's doing good coverage. And so there are a lot of communities where it's not a news desert for lack of news media, but it is effectively a news desert or a news drought because it's a lazy paper. They don't cover things very much. It's all ads and no content or what have you. And again, it's just our market is so complex and unregulated that it's really hard to measure this thing.
I would say there's another term you may hear out of the US, which is ghost newspaper. And that speaks to what Bill is talking about. There are many newspapers that the newspaper still publishes, still sells ads, is produced in a community, but there may be no local reporter for that newspaper. This is the big chain owned ones, or just in all these areas, the coverage has been so diminished by the economic cuts and the loss of reporting jobs that the coverage is so thin. And that's what's confusing to the public too. They're like, well, the news exists, it just is lousy, you know? And so, or they see a lot of national news, but it's just all repeating the same national stories rather than covering the communities or the issues below that.
We
So-
also have a phenomenon here called masquerade news. It's nicknamed pink slime news, right? So, and that's, I will explain pink slime to you and the relative nature of that when we're offline, because it's very complicated. But basically, masquerade news site is, it looks like a news site. It looks legitimate. It has some local content, but generally what it is it's an overtly politically biased source of information, often misleading information, that's bankrolled by political action groups. And you can generally tell a masquerade news site by a few things. First of all, the content is mostly repackaged content from other sources, government records, government announcements, other local media. It's often very poorly edited, so you don't have, it doesn't lacks that quality, but it also lacks transparency. If you try to, the About Us page is like, oh, you know, we're part of the largest network of local news sites in America with no contact information, no names or anything else like that. And so there are places where you might consider it not a news desert because it has one of these masquerade sites, but it's not real news. And the good thing about it is we just saw a study the other day. Very few people read the masquerade news. So it's not really competing for eyeballs, but they are getting local advertising, and that's a problem for community media. Tim, could you comment on the masquerade news thing in rural America?
Yes. The mainstay of the rural communities I know is going to be a county seat weekly. And traditionally there would have been maybe a regional daily that had maybe a bureau nearby, and it would, and that was fundamental. The combination of that weekly and a daily was fundamental to statewide conversation about what's happening where, and the state knowing what's going on in a rural area and vice versa. The disappearance of the bureaus, they've all retrenched in the metro areas. The ghost newspaper phenomenon, I think, is widespread, especially with the consolidation that we've seen in the newspaper chains. I think I have seen small outlets start up in rural places that are very, very slanted and have a very, their opinion partisan publications. There are a number of kind of national organizations that are starting kind of almost chapter-like publications to deliver partisan news. And I don't know, I think there's been more of an erosion within the traditional communication industry in rural areas. And I think what has replaced it in large part is social media in many cases, Facebook and Twitter. And what happens locally, I believe, is that people who are in discussions then cite these pink slime state sources in their local discussions. That's what I've seen a lot of. And then you get, oh, so-and-so says this, and it's not a credible news source. I think that really contributes to a difficult public discussion on any issue locally.
Okay, next question. Slindili has a follow-up question.
This is for Tim. I was curious when you spoke about some of these common words that come up when people report about rural areas, which are more stereotyping, because we find that often as well in our country when it comes, especially content around Black areas. Someone will say a dusty street and they'll be referring to a township which is in a large metro, which is anything but dusty. And I'd just like to know, do you think that is because of lack of resources in newsrooms, or is it purely lazy journalism or ignorance?
I think someone who takes the time to visit a place and write a story, I think it's hard to be a good lazy journalist. So I don't think it's lazy in the cases where there's actual reporting and writing going on. I think within kind of the opinion echo chamber, it's easy to put those words in very quickly and lazily. I think there's two things. A lot of reporters are really not familiar with rural places. They don't know how rural places talk about themselves. And then also, I think there's this editorial function that doesn't backstop those reporters with those kinds of language, that kind of language. And I can only imagine what it would be like in South Africa. And one example from this editorial function, there was a piece in the New York Times Magazine, which is a lot of news features and profiles and things. This one was about a rural school, I believe it was in Alabama. It was a student who was trying to improve his chances of going on to college. It was about teacher turnover within this district and superintendent turnover and just kind of a decaying public sector within education. But it primarily was about one school, and the headline was "The Tragedy of Rural Schools." So I think there's a lot of that within newsrooms just because they're totally not in connection. And we get this flash of what it's like. Township, it's dusty. So I can use that word. And they don't. And so I think it's helpful for people to push back against that and say, appreciate the story. I like this or that. This language here, there's no dust in my neighborhood. Why do you use that? And I wish there were more conversations that way. I don't think people's intentions are bad necessarily. I think it's more of just, it's a cliche, it's a cliche.
There's also, I think, a lot of reporters go into autofill mode where there's a phrase here and they're just going to use the one that they expect to use. I remember I had a student write a story about Athens, for those who don't know, we have the Hocking River that runs through Athens, and it is a lazy river by all measures. It floods once in a while, but the water just moves so slowly. And she's like, nestled next to the roaring waters of the Hocking River, and it was just like, she spent 4 years of her life here, and she just felt like waters had to roar and a small town had to be nestled. And it's just like, these are like the autofill things. She didn't think twice about it. And I was like, oh, let's go for a walk. I literally took her out of the building down the hill. It's like, is that a roaring river? She's like, oh, I don't know why I did that. So a lot of this stuff is just automatic. To get to Tim's point, we talked about parachute journalism. And like he said, if somebody takes the time to go someplace and visit someplace and write about it, that's commendable. But the parachute journalists often forget that they have very tremendous limitations on their understanding of the local community. Many times they jump in, they go to the town center, they talk to local leaders rather than people on the fringes, and they don't spend enough time there to learn about the nuances and the realities, the lived experience of being in this place. They walk away pretty much like a tourist would, with some broad assumptions they meet 5 people and they have broad assumptions about the people in the community. And I think that is human nature, but as journalists, we need to kind of develop kind of a backstop, like Tim said, where we check ourselves like, okay, are we falling into the stereotypes? Are we falling into the autofill language? Are we making broad assumptions and generalizations without any evidence that that's the case? Sorry to jump in.
I think also, even if the reporter has done the work of traveling to the community and talking to folks, the editor's job is to push the writer out of all those cliches. And you have an editor that never set foot out of New York or Washington, DC or LA. So it's harder for them to understand the texture and tapestry. Like you were able to take that student right out and you were basically being their editor in that point. I think we can walk down the street and see that it's harder for the reporter that might travel to that city or county, write the story, and then there's not going to be the challenging from the editor to say, well, are we sure that's the language we want to use? Does that thing really look like that thing? Because it's funny when you were talking, Tim, although we serve very different communities, we also in Baltimore get annoyed every time the New York Times writes about us, because it's like, no, like, again, they're doing the same thing. They're in New York City. They're not in Baltimore City. So they think of Baltimore as a specific thing. They think of it as, I don't know if you guys have seen like The Wire or crime or urban, and there's so much other things here that you don't know if you're not here.
Yeah, that's true. And, after the Trump election, there were all these major media that are trying to figure out what's going on in rural America. And so they did this drops in, and they started repeating a lot of the stereotypes we have of rural areas, especially in Appalachia, depressed economies, poverty, drug addiction, no education. Tim can speak about this more than I can.
They found every diner in Middle America and just only went to diners. Like, I don't know who decided the diner was going to be the representative for this area of the country.
All right.
I think you're also seeing in that's part of the hollowing out of real reporting, because you are getting more people parachute in, or they're not actually spending time in a community. Even if they are parachuting in, there's always been some of that in national news, but they're not spending the time. And so they go for an easy, which usually means a stereotype. So yeah, I think that's also part of this whole rebuilding of the ecosystem. It's not just rural, like we saw the same in the Midwest. We see the same in the South, including in really major metro areas, that they just are not reflected in our national news, which is increasingly driven out of New York or DC. And so you don't really have that sharing of local news perspectives, and through these nonprofits and trying to get their content distributed more widely and elevated to the national level. I think that's one way we start to attack that.
It's a very good point, Sue. Thank you. Other questions from the group? Chris has another question.
Hi, Sue. I think this one is for you. I just want to find out, you mentioned about, fund writing or donor writing, etc. Just want to find out, what kind of strings do we need to pluck at when it comes to writing for funding, especially when you approaching, foundations and philanthropists, etc. And the reason why I'm asking this is, you spoke about storytelling. In that storytelling, are you telling the story about the actual sustainability of the publication, or are you talking directly to them about the actual logistics of running the organization and costs thereof? Or do what's your approach? I just want to find that out. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the story you're telling, foundations tend to have a certain language, and it doesn't sound like a sales pitch, but it is a sales pitch. And the story you're telling is, when they fund you, the impact that's going to have, not on journalists, but out in the world. How is it going to improve the community? How is it going to help people live better lives? How does it increase equity or address other wrongs? And so you want to go to that end. Here's what will result from the work. Here's what is resulting from the work we do. And if you give us this, here's what we can accomplish. And then to do that, and that's where you may get into some of the costs or operational, what that will take to do it. But you're telling the story of what their money will accomplish, not just in the newsroom, but the end impact on the country, the community, an area of people who care about an issue, something like that. So that's the basic storytelling arc, so that they understand what they're investing in. And in that, it's not that much different than if you're a for-profit and going to an investor and saying, invest in us, because some of them care a lot about your sustainability. Well, are you a viable organization? We know news is in trouble. And that's an underpinning, but it's not usually your main pitch, because that's about you. And you're really, for grant funders, they usually are trying to create some bigger social good. The actual format, they usually have forms, and you really, the secret is, as much as you can, and this is way easier said than done, but you want to find a relationship and talk to them and find out what's important to them. And you can find out some of that on their websites. But if you can go to events or find out anybody who can directly introduce you, it's important, because they are besieged by requests. So if you just go in cold, hit that form to apply, you know, you're in a big crowd. So that relationship building, you know, there's good and bad about that. They do become allies in a way. It also can be that they just are funding people they know, and there's all kinds of downsides to that as well. But the reality is, given the volume of requests they get, that's why. The other thing I would say is, as has been said, there are relatively few foundations in the US that fund just news. So in many cases, you're going to foundations that fund a variety of things, and you may also have a bit of that storytelling about why news is important. And we know it is, but there's only a few studies that have really shown it builds, strengthens community ties. It helps people understand each other. In the US, it increases voting rates and the number of people who run for public office. And there are all kinds of social goods that come from it. Depending on the funder, if they already understand that, if they already fund news, you may not have to tell that story as much. But if they're new to news, you have to introduce that whole idea of the social good and why it might fit with their larger social interests.
And added to that is the issue of, you know, a newspaper is also a conduit for economic development. And so economic development groups have a vested interest. I mean, when we talk about, we have this metaphor, the canary in the coal mine, that, you know, coal miners used to take canaries with them into the coal mine so that the canaries would die if there was no oxygen before the miners, they could get out. A town whose newspaper dies, the newspaper is the canary in the coal mine for that community. If the newspaper can't sustain it, the local economy is struggling. And that is almost always missing from this conversation. There's tons and tons and tons of economic development money out there, and they don't view the local news media, the legitimate local news media, as an essential partner in that economic development. Sorry, Sue, did you have a comment?
I wanted to address one other thing, because you asked about donor communications to individual donors. That's more akin to consumer marketing. It's you're getting emails, you're reaching out to those people, communicating with them regularly, not always asking for money. You're making them part of your community. They're like your most loyal readers. You want to be communicating directly. And then as they're opening things up, you may create regular outreaches to them. So you're telling them about your biggest stories, but putting a plea at the end and say, hey, it costs us this to produce this. If you like this kind of journalism or value it, we hope you support us. And include that. When you post those transparent things, you update your about section, you post your owners, you post your financial transparency, tell them about that. We want you to know where we're coming from. Here's what we can tell you. And, you know, and just communicate constantly. That as you get bigger, people automate that in like a marketing automation. So you have an email list and use software to personalize those, but send them at large scale to a large mailing list.
Your About Us page is very, very important. So you should spend lots of time on the About Us page and make sure it's updated frequently, I would say.
I wanted to add just two quick things. For me, the writing and communicating with a potential funder is all about the audience. So we know how to write for an audience within our community. And the trick for me is to how do I write for this audience that of a program officer in a formal institution or less formal. What are they interested in? What's the language they use? How do they understand the world? And I have to write with them in mind specifically. The other thing we've seen tangentially here in the US is that for-profit media outlets have been getting some grant funding for projects. And so it's not just for nonprofit organizations, but some foundations have seen value with kind of partnerships in the community that media get involved with. And that may be another way to kind of dip your toe into this world.
Thank you, Tim. Any other questions from the group? Yes, Steve.
Yeah, this is for Sue. I've just been looking at the guides that you've got, the free guides that you are available on your website, and they look really amazing. There's some very useful stuff, which is, I assume, particularly targeted at the US market. But I'm thinking there might be an opportunity to facilitate access to some of that material by South African publishers via the AIP. Is that something you've done with others? Would you be happy for publishers outside of the US to have access to that material?
Yes, and I think you'll find it's virtually all open and free on our website. We do have members, and we do, you know, the collective fundraising and news match is limited to our members. But as I said, I am happy, and I do a lot of presentations like this in a lot of time zones by Zoom and sometimes in person. And like INN is focused on the US, and the growth here has been fast. And then also looking at the equity access issues to news in the US are nowhere near solved. So we're really busy with that, but we believe in this mission, and we believe news is being reinvented globally from this much more grassroots perspective. So almost everything on our site, any of your folks in South Africa should be able to access. You do have some nonprofits, a nonprofit network in South Africa. We had a staffer actually go there and visit them a few years ago, and one of our funders is a South African, a past funder, actually doesn't currently fund us, but he's based in London, and he funds South African media. So we hear some of the region, but I'm happy to do a talk like this, or we can help walk anybody through those resources. The resources are developed for the US, and those cultural habits about supportive news and nonprofits do vary a lot country to country. So sometimes, like with Australia, we have an ongoing relationship with a similar organization, and we could talk to you and say, well, how does it work in South Africa? And then help think, well, maybe how might you think about adapting what's working in the US to the local culture? Like, I'm not going to be very smart about that, and our materials wouldn't be smart about that because we don't know your culture, but we can brainstorm with you. And I think between the two of us, find ways, because as I said, it's not just a tax status, it's this mind shift of starting with the community's needs and with journalism not being outside the community, but part of the community, that I think is a global movement. I think it's what'll revive journalism.
Excellent. And Dealey, did you have a question?
Thank you. I would like to ask this question to all of you guys. Do you sometimes find yourselves under pressure of not or writing hardcore stories? Maybe a pressure from the people who are linked to the funders. Can you be able to write stories without fear or favor?
I'll go first here. So I've worked in traditional newsrooms back from the golden era of newspapers, so to speak, and I've worked in a startup nonprofit newsroom. My feeling is that there was more pressure in commercial media on news production content than there is currently in my current role at a nonprofit news organization. Now, I work within an organization that shares, our publication's values are the larger organization's values. Our missions are completely aligned. Our goals for what we're trying to accomplish are parallel. So it's not like there's the ad department trying to make money and the newsroom trying to make trouble. I used to think my job was to get the publisher in trouble. That was my favorite thing to do with an editorial. But anyway, I feel less pressure in a nonprofit context. And part of it is that we kind of know going in, we write proposals and we know how we're going to approach issues and everyone's aware of it up front. So there are fewer surprises. That's just my experience.
We had a lot of conversations before we got our initial $1 million gift from the Lillian Hollis Center Foundation. This was kind of led by a younger family member who brought some of the older family members along. So he had already done a lot of work in preparing for the idea of actually divesting money as opposed to still just giving out money piecemeal, just giving away that power completely as opposed to kind of siphoning it out. But then there was more conversations because some of them didn't know the beat. So they were like, well, who are you exactly? What does this mean? What does this look like? We had conversations for about a year, but we knew that the end point of that conversation was them giving us this money with no strings attached. So right now there is not, we have a little blurb in the paper that acknowledges their gift, but there is no obligation that I have to fulfill for them. I don't have to go before the family members and say, this is our editorial calendar. These are the things I want to write about. I don't ever talk to them. I talk to the younger one because his work is similar to the work I do. So we work together sometimes and we'll put their events in our paper. But there was a no strings attached agreement that came with that $1 million investment. Now, I think because we've been so explicit in what we do and how we do it, that has not yet been a conversation. So we've gotten money from the T. Rowe Price Foundation. They've given us money both specifically for those boxes and also just for general operating funds. There was never a conversation. We have gotten money from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which is a nonprofit here in the States that focuses on young people, the needs of young people who are not even, I'd never thought of them as journalism funders, but I think that to Sue's point, people are or organizations are slowly learning that they need journalism. So Annie E. Casey reached out to myself, the Baltimore Banner, which is a larger nonprofit that I've mentioned a few times, our local NPR radio station, and the radio station at a historically Black college called Morgan University. And they want us to write about young people, but that is where their ask started and stopped. It was not saying you have to write about health and young people, or you have to write these. They just want to give us money because there's not enough journalism around young people in Baltimore City, especially like journalism that's not, these are, everything is terrible and dire and these kids are suffering and bad. They just said we want to put more investment into that kind of work. But other than that, they're like, we're out of it and hands off on purpose. So I think that has to be the case. There's money that I already know that I would never take. There's standards that I have that I know that I would not, because I would lose my audience. So there's on my side knowing, and then they're having the funders having to know that this money is, you're putting it down and then your hands are off the table.
Yeah. There's a lively debate on our listserv right now among members who will accept individual donations as somebody who might be an elected politician, and those that don't, and what policies they have on their site. So every organization, I think the important thing is to think it through and talk about it with your board and staff and figure out what makes sense for you and put up an editorial independence policy. I would agree with Tim that advertiser influence on traditional news outlets is at least as great. But I do know quite a few of our members have had usually an individual donor, not a foundation. It is rare that a foundation tries to interfere in coverage. Where they will fund may shape what you can afford to cover. If there's a foundation that will fund education coverage, you might be able to put more reporters on that if that foundation doesn't exist, but they're not interfering in how you cover it. Individual donors often might get upset about a story, particularly if it challenges an organization they're part of or a company they're close to. And that's another reason we encourage all news organizations to have a diversity of funding sources so they can walk away. So if any donor ever says, if you keep covering this, I think these are unfair, wrong, blah, 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 I'm going to never donate again, the news organization say, we understand that, we respect that, we wish you well. End of conversation. And not, they may take a cut in their funding, but that it wouldn't be disastrous. So most nonprofits also try to have like no more than 15% of their funding from one source. That's just prudent. You can lose 15% of your funds and it's going to hurt, but it's not going to threaten you. If you lose 50% of your funds suddenly, then you're more vulnerable to those funding sources. I also put a couple guidelines in chat, one from the American Press Institute that's pure gold.
Thank you, Sue. We have time for one more question.
Closing remark. Thank you so much, panel. I just like to take this opportunity on behalf of the AIP members that are here and publishers, independent publishers in South Africa. I'd just like to say thank you for taking some time out, inspiring us, guiding us, and also sharing your experiences. I know that it would have been great for us to also share our struggles with you. However, we would like to stay away from the doom and gloom part of the industry, but rather look at the horizon. And I just like to say thank you on behalf of my colleagues here, and also thank you on behalf of our readers in South Africa. You guys have really inspired us and also opened up our eyes about an alternative source of revenue that will be able to sustain our media organizations. So thank you.
Yes, thank all three of you for taking the time out.
My pleasure. I also
All
put
right.
an email in case anybody ever wants to reach out or have a question or connect in any kind of way.
And that's fine too. For this project, what I'm asking is if they have follow-up questions to send them to me so that I can consolidate them and then we can share the answers with everybody. But obviously anybody who feels comfortable communicating directly with you, that would be fine too. It's not a requirement, but it's just for purposes of the program. Thank you three so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.